Hello again and welcome to this week's briefing. Sarah Michaels is with me here today, so the topic must be Russia, and with good reason we think, because the BP-TNK joint venture, that most lucrative but also controversial of enterprises, became very much a centre of media attention this week with the spectacular resignation of Mikhail Fridman, the Chief Executive Officer. So there's much for us to think about here, Sarah, in terms of unpacking some of the tensions at work in this joint venture, but also setting them in the wider context of policy on the energy front and the business of Russia risk, which we follow carefully in Analytica.
Absolutely. And the first and perhaps most important thing to note is that Fridman and the other industrialists who control the Russian half of TNK-BP are not necessarily walking in lockstep with the Kremlin. So there may indeed be an opportunity here for Rosneft or for another state-owned company to take a stake in TNK-BP, but that isn't necessarily by the design of Fridman himself.
No. And would it be desirable for BP? This is a very big thing for them, responsible for a lot of their revenues. It's the reason why they've been able to write nice checks for their shareholders.
Yes.
They know a bit about Rosneft, don't they?
Well, they certainly do know a bit about Rosneft, and as you note, TNK-BP is a huge part of the BP empire. It accounts for nearly 1/4 of BP's reserves, for example. But as you rightly noted, BP tried and failed to expand its presence in Russia very publicly when it attempted to pursue a joint venture in the Arctic with Rosneft last year, which, as we know, ultimately ended up going to ExxonMobil. So on the one hand, there's a lot of water under that bridge. On the other hand, if you imagine a scenario in which TNK-BP still exists in some form, but BP controls 50% of the company, Rosneft takes 25%, let's say, and then Russian industrialists from the private sector have 10 to 15% each, then that leaves BP in a much more dominant position than it currently has with the 50-50 ownership structure.
No sector matters so much for Russian government revenues and for the strategic position of the country than energy. How has energy policy making or the prospects for it changed with the recent government reformation?
There has been a huge increase in uncertainty surrounding the energy sector and the oil sector in particular. And part of that arises from the move of the former Deputy Prime Minister Igor Sechin to the CEO of Rosneft, but then also to chairman of the board of a holding called Rosneft-Gas. And the reason that Rosneft-Gas matters is because that now serves as the gatekeeper for privatization, again, not only in the oil sector, but gas, electricity, hydropower, etc., etc. So Sechin is now in a position officially and informally to act as the gatekeeper for privatization in the energy sector. No, absolutely not. No less powerful for being out of government.
And Putin's man?
Absolutely Putin's man, yes, yes. Now, the two of them have a long-standing friendship, so there are informal ties, as well as political ties of very long-standing.
We've thought a little bit and analysed to some extent the privatisation programme in recent months. How closer are we than we were when it was unfolded to being implemented?
We are closer, but that said, it's not happening with any great speed. And part of that is the aforementioned policy uncertainty. Sechin, of course, is no champion of privatization. That doesn't mean that he's necessarily going to block everything. He certainly will be very wary of divesting any stakes in Rosneft itself and perhaps a couple of other companies that are near and dear to him. But even with a company such as Sberbank, Russia's largest financial institution, where the CEO, German Gref, is a known and avid proponent of privatization, market valuation of Sberbank has fallen by about 19% since the start of the year. And so looking at it purely in commercial terms, now is really not a good time for the Russian authorities to move ahead with privatization. So the earliest that we would see a Sberbank asset sale is probably September or October.
Let's turn finally, Sarah, to the matter of the risk that we're monitoring in Russia through our global risk monitor, the drift or move towards authoritarianism, and how do the events that we've been talking about play into that, do we think?
Well, it's a very interesting question because rightly we've been focused on the oil sector, but the important thing to remember here is that some of the trends that we're seeing on the energy side are not necessarily reflected in the government's entire agenda. And so while risks and uncertainties have increased dramatically for companies doing business in the oil sector, writ large, the government itself has not taken a particularly authoritarian or statist turn. So that's why our assessment of the risk of authoritarianism in Russia has actually fallen quite considerably over the last 2 weeks with the appointment of Medvedev's new government.
Good. Sarah, thanks very much. And thank you for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed this discussion. The future of Russia, the Russia risk as we call it, will feature prominently in our prospects for the next quarter of the year. We begin publishing in the Daily Brief that series tomorrow. Do look out for that, and please do let us know if we can help you in any way secure your strategic objectives in this complex and volatile world. Thanks again.